Okay, today let's talk Commodore. In 2004, a plug-and-play joystick was released that contained 30 built-in Commodore 64 games. But this wasn't emulation. An actual computer on a chip was developed and placed inside. I decided to put this PC board into the shell of an old handheld case to make it a portable Commodore 64. The great thing about the board is that it was made to be hackable, so I was able to add a way to access over 50 additional C64 games on it. So what we have here is a project that I put together back in 2016. It's a handheld Commodore 64. If the case looks familiar, that's because it's a repurposed Sega Game Gear that was not working, and I gutted it out except for the sound chip. Let's look at the outside of it a little more closely. On the left is the D-pad, which is used instead of a joystick. Above it is a small button that I added that is used for the spacebar. I've added 4 buttons at the bottom that are used for additional keyboard keys. On the right, the start button is used to reset the system. The 1 button is the fire button, and the 2 button is used for F7. Inside one of the battery doors is a lithium battery that I bought from Adafruit that you can recharge using a wall plug. On the other side, I squeezed in a keyboard chip, which is how I added on the button to control the spacebar. And in the middle, there's the cartridge slot, and in place of that, I put an SD card reader. Here's some gameplay of the game 1942. The C64 on a chip was designed by Jerry Ellsworth, who I met at the Midwest Gaming Classic in 2011. It was nice talking to her at the show. I actually told her about my idea of making a handheld C64, and she was very encouraging. She also signed the back of my first joystick, as you can see here. If you compare the joystick to my handheld, you can see how the buttons match up. Here are the 4 bottom ones. The left fire button is wired to number 1. The right fire button is wired to number 2. The reset button is wired up to start. Now the DTV joystick comes with only 30 built-in games, but it was purposely made to be hackable because the board inside has labeled soldering points to add external joystick, keyboard, and floppy drive. There were actually different versions of the DTV that were released. The first one was released in North America by Mammoth Toys. When you turn it on, after some introduction screens, you are presented with a list of 30 games. You can move down and up through the menu, and then you can click the fire button to select the game you want to play. A few of the games require additional keys, which is why they added extra buttons on the controller. This DTV is the one I used for my project. Here's some gameplay footage of a game called Synapse. The second type of DTV was released in Europe by the Toy Lobster Company. Since it was released in Europe, it uses the PAL TV signal instead of NTSC. Most of the 30 games are the same, but the list is a bit different. I think there are about 6 or 7 differences. One interesting thing is that this one has the entire California games instead of a couple of events like the first DTV. This DTV also has flash memory, and some hackers have flashed the memory so it boots directly to their own games menu. The third type of DTV is actually not a joystick at all, but it is a driving controller. It is called Hummer Off-Road Racing. It was sold in the USA by Radio Shack. Its internal board also has flash memory. Although it is hackable, some of the joystick lines are missing from the board. However, hackers have wired the inputs up to the user port, and then used patch games to get them to work. Here's some gameplay. There's an archive site by David Murray on the Wayback Machine that discusses all the different versions of the DTV, and it has information about the hardware and how it can be modded and hacked. I'll post the link in the description. Alright, back to my handheld. If I turn it on, it goes directly to the 30 built-in games. However, there is a built-in Easter egg in which if you wiggle the direction left and right quickly at startup, it will boot directly to an alternate menu in which you can choose to enter BASIC. Then, if you hold down the fire button, you can access a virtual keyboard to type on. You would just use the D-pad to select the letters while you hold down the fire button. Here I will type in a load command to get to a menu that is a file browser. This is being read off of the SD card that I have attached to the back of the handheld. When I pick a game, it loads, and some take longer than others. Then you can go ahead and play it. Here's a list of the games that are loaded on the SD card. These are tested and they work well. There are many other games that for one reason or another I could not get to work. For example, if a game uses the other joystick port exclusively, I couldn't get it to work. On the internet, I found a folder that had a bunch of games that were modified to work on a DTV, whether it be for remap buttons or whatever, but these games seem to be modded to work for the European DTV. I don't know why that would make a difference, but I did find a few that worked with mine and a few that didn't. Other games I just downloaded from an archive and tested them to see if they worked. I'm sure there are others that would work with this, but with the number of games out there, it would take almost forever to figure out which ones work and which ones don't. Here's some gameplay of the game Rambo First Blood Part 2. I just downloaded it from somewhere and luckily it worked. This is a game that also requires the space bar as a secondary action button. You use it to change weapons, and you also use it to save POWs. This is one of the reasons why I put that extra button above my D-pad. If I knew how to mod C64 games, I would have swapped it with the F7 button. But this is what works for me in these situations. Now about that extra button above the D-pad that controls the spacebar. I found an old PC keyboard, opened it up, and discovered that each key has two paths going from it to a chip in the corner. When the key is pressed, these two paths connect. I just had to figure out where on the chip each path connected to. Once I figured that out, I just connected two wires on the chip in those places and put a button in the middle to connect them. Originally I was going to use this button for the letter K. That's because another Easter egg on the DTV is that if you send a K signal to it when it starts, it will automatically send you to the BASIC prompt. However, I didn't realize that you don't have access to the virtual keyboard when you do this, so it was useless to me. However, the spacebar is important when it comes to gaming on the C64. For one thing, when there's a crack screen on a game, usually the only way to get past it is to hit the spacebar. And as I've mentioned before, sometimes the spacebar is an additional action button needed for a game. Here's some gameplay of Tubin. One weird thing that I discovered is that to play another game, I can't just use the reset or start button alone. I have to shut it off, then turn it on, and after I see the Commodore symbol, I have to then hit the reset button. Then I can let it load as usual, whether I play the built-in games or the ones off the SD card. If I don't do this, for some reason, most of the buttons won't work properly when playing a game. Also, if I went into BASIC, I would get an error message, something about VLOAD. I'm willing to guess that shutting it off and then using the start button completely resets the memory, which then allows everything to work fine. How did I connect everything inside? Well, if you recall, one of my other videos involved creating an Atari 2600 handheld. I learned a lot about this stuff from Ben Heck's book, Hacking Video Game Consoles. Ben Heck is always at the Midwest Gaming Classic, and he's always willing to talk about any projects that he's been working on. So I used my limited experience along with pictures of the hackable DTV board that I found on the internet. I found some extra black buttons on eBay. They were advertised as for a PS3 controller. Under the buttons, I put PC board and soldered tack switches to them. I did this also with the buttons that already were part of the Sega case. For the screen, I found a small LCD on eBay that shipped from China. I believe it was extra inventory for a rear view screen for a car. I did have to Dremel the physical viewing area a bit so the entire screen is visible on the handheld. For the floppy emulated SD card reader, I found something called SD2IEC that you can order online. I 3D printed a small piece of plastic around it to fill in the space. Anything else that needed to be held together so it wouldn't rattle around, I used hot glue. If it's good enough for Ben Heck to use, then we might as well use it. So all in all, it was kind of a neat project to work on. I admit it is a bit annoying to type in the load command every time I want to play a game on the SD card, but the battery lasts a long time and it's fun to play some Commodore games on the go. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.